I don't use that term, cross-cultural training. The term that I use is cultural humility. And that term is born out of work that came from a program that developed at Children's Hospital Oakland in the 1990s when I was working there as a pediatrician. In the United States and across the country, across the world really, this term cultural competence and thus cross-cultural training actually emerged in 1989 with the work of Terry Cross and colleagues in the Pacific Northwest in the United States.
My gut reaction is, well, I'm not comfortable with that term. I think it's a really old term and a term that comes from a particular perspective. So it comes from the what's often spoke about in circles when you're critiquing anthropology is the white gaze or the white lens, which is all about looking at something from a particular perspective, and in this field, particularly looking at it from a non-Indigenous perspective.
For us at Children's Hospital, what happened was we learned that it was not about competence so much, or even kind of cross-cultural training, meaning learn everything you need to know about Black people, or learn everything you need to know about Latinos, or learn everything you need to know about, broadly speaking, Asian Americans, the largeness of Asia in the world, certainly not being possible.
You get to the point where the practitioner, or the future practitioner, is able to see that their view, their world is not the only view, the only world, and that it's not the right world. So getting people to a point of unsettlement about self as central to others as equally central and important.
It's been my experience working in healthcare settings that the culture that's problematic is not necessarily the culture of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but the culture of the health service and systems.
The whiteness in the system from which I come avoids looking at itself if you use cross-cultural training. So in a real context, it means that it avoids the source of racism and oppression for Indigenous peoples. That's what it does.
For me, the whole cross-cultural thing is interesting because, in a sense, and what I tell my students is that every clinical interaction that they'll have is a cross-cultural encounter.
Power is something, again, it's a little bit like my own culture. It's so embedded, it's so normal that you don't notice it until you see someone who's disempowered. And we have many, many examples where I'm standing beside my Indigenous colleagues and all questions and all interactions are referred through myself, and I realise what's happening is I'm being given some privilege that my colleague is not.
One of the formulas for racism is stereotyping plus power equals racism. So you can stereotype, but if you have no power to alter somebody's life at that moment, it's discrimination. Maybe it might be something less than racism. But in fact, racism kills. It kills in many ways. So power imbalances are inherent as part of settler society.
For a very, very long time, hospitals had a native ward. Native is a term that many Aboriginal people do not like because it was, again, a generic term and a way of marginalising people. And hospitals had a native ward. Now, in a lot of rural centres around Australia, that was a tin shed, so not in the hospital. Those power imbalances in the way that institutions had set up and saw as normal, many Aboriginal people know those histories and know those stories and find them to be very, very problematic.
When you're unwell, you're most vulnerable. And so finding a way to speak up and speak out in that particular moment can be really difficult. I guess that's why we try and encourage health professionals to be open to listening and learning rather than talking down to disempowering our mob. I think the challenging thing for many of our health professionals is that they're being indoctrinated into the culture of their discipline. They're being trained as health professionals who are meant to be experts. And of course they are in their field, but sometimes when we position ourselves as experts, we forget to listen and learn from other people.
We know from so many studies, we don't need another one, I think, that if we listen to who's speaking in a room, in a patient visit, in 15 minutes, 12 minutes of it, the doctor's speaking or the provider's speaking. 3 minutes of it, the patient's speaking. Should at least be reversed, if not half and half. Unless providers are able to quiet the insides, including the chatter in the mind, and even the chatter of one's own story, it's not really possible to hear. And to not only hear, but to provide the environment so that the person across from you has free rein to say as much or as little as they may want to about why they are here to see me as a provider.
I know for myself, as an English first language speaker, silence is not a comfortable thing. For a lot of people who speak English, sitting in silence is a real challenge. And when you're working with cultures who have silence embedded in them, in their communication style, it's something that you really have to work at.
If you are listening in a way that is, well, I've asked a question, I'm not getting the answer I want, so I'll ask the question again, or in simpler terms, or I'll increase my volume, that is only going to make that communication get worse.
Listening is very important. There was a publication that came out over 10 years ago. It's done mostly on white doctors. It comes from Western Ontario in London. They asked the question to physicians who had stayed in our communities in a certain part of Ontario for greater than 10 years. They've been practicing there for a number of years. And they did a qualitative study. And what they discovered was that what was it about the quality of those physicians, all of whom were not or are not Indigenous, that allowed them to stay in the environment and continue to provide care. And one of the top themes was their ability to begin to listen.
Yeah, well, as you can imagine, there's a spectrum of responses that we get to the Indigenous health curriculum from, some at one end who are totally on board and actually champions and sort of even, wanting to go beyond even what we're trying to teach them, down to the other end of the spectrum where it's resistance, and often not just resistance, but actual sort of antipathy and really negative kind of approaches towards the curriculum.
When I teach students who come to my classes because they've elected to study the subject, it generally is a really pleasant experience. It's when you teach Indigenous content within the compulsory subjects that you tend to encounter a fair degree of resistance. I used to work in a rural health setting where I had to facilitate the compulsory cultural awareness program of the health service, and it was extremely hostile. Name calling, abuse. It was quite a hostile encounter.
Indigenous health, by its very nature, is political, must be political, and by its very nature appears to be anti-white or anti-settler, and it's never. But it's how Canada, anyway, is situated. So yes, so students might, their internalized barriers come up.
Our first response always with the first day of the Cultural Awareness Day is this: why am I doing this? It's always a question that comes up. Why am I doing this? What's this? It has nothing to do with medicine. And so for me, it's that connection back to medicine. This is what it is.
And I think that as an Indigenous educator, there is a different kind of resistance to the material when we're at the front of the classroom. I know that there are students who will struggle with me being the facilitator of the learning journey. And for some of them, I often get students to be open about this. I know that for some of my students, when they look at me, they're wondering whether I'm a real Aboriginal or whether I'm a real academic, because I can't possibly be the both at the same time.
You'll have a whole spectrum of responses in the room, and how you deliver to one group might be different as to how you deliver to another group. You might have another room where that isn't the case, where there is a lot of resistance to what you're doing. There might be belligerent and racialised comments in the room that then cause discord within the classroom. And so you need to be able to manage that well.
One of the things I would say is that you really have to have strategies at a whole lot of different levels. One from the classroom, from the very micro level, but right up to the sort of echelons of power within the institution. Because in one sense, I can almost sympathise with students who display resistance or who really don't engage with the Indigenous health curriculum, because in a sense, a lot of the messages they're getting from the institution and from the rest of the curriculum is that actually Māori health isn't that important to be a good doctor or to be a good nurse or whatever. So I think you do have to have strategies that address that institutional issue and address all the perhaps negative stuff that they're getting elsewhere from other teachers and from the rest of the curriculum.
The training has to be delivered in such a way that you're bringing people with you, because it is a journey. This isn't something where you just get information and then you know it, There are things about the way we teach that if it's delivered in a way that is problematic, well, then it's going to be ineffective.
If you jump on someone who's sort of being reactionary, I guess you feed that sort of polarisation a bit more. So it's how do you manage to respond, to provide another way of presenting the material that you're talking about, or another view that actually doesn't challenge them to say they're wrong, but challenges them so that they start to think that there's another way of being here.
So we found that when we used the approach of curious inquiry and seeing the person across from us as expert, that all kinds of information would come out in the clinical encounter that otherwise would just not even be, you'd never know about it. They were unknowns.
Trying to keep people engaged over the training period, I would generally try to get those individuals to provide examples as well. Has there ever been a time when you felt discriminated against? Has there ever been an example where you felt overlooked or bullied? Has there ever been a time in your life where the government has been able to make policy that has affected you? And that's usually where people then start to realise that they have experienced certain things, but they haven't experienced all of those facets that impact on Aboriginal or Indigenous people.
I tell a bit of a story about my own heritage, which is mainly Irish, with smatterings of English and Scottish and Swedish. And I talk about, well, in the UK in 1761, there was an act passed by the nobility, the Enclosures Act, which was all about pushing people off country. So to try and build some stories like that around parallels is often gets people to shift their perspective. So they don't just see it as a black-white thing, they don't just see it as an Australian thing, but they see it as a global understanding of how power systems work and the impacts that those power systems have on communities.
Within the hospital, there were a handful of us, maybe two handfuls of us, who were clear that in order for the program to be successful, it had to be embedded in the institution. And that wasn't simply going to happen by us asking for that to occur, but that we had to think of the ways in which transformation would occur in the relationships in the institution so that it would become part of what was important for the institution to hold on to.
I mean, I think one of the other really important levers for change in an organisation is the accreditation process, or the processes by which an organisation is held accountable. If we can get the external, accreditation body to say, well, look, you need to do this A, B, and C, we often find that suddenly change becomes much easier.
What happened at our institution was that the accreditation, we came up for accreditation. We had worked with a number of people who were the accreditors in Canada about Indigenous health when we developed our core competency statement a number of years earlier. And they knew quite quickly to come to us and ask about Indigenous health and what was going on. And so their recommendation was what you see today at the University of Manitoba.
One of the key domains of learning within the medical program, as an example, is the Māori health domain. Okay, so it kind of formalises it within the curriculum and makes it, I guess, more difficult for people to challenge why it's there, makes it more difficult to try and undermine what's going on within the Māori health curriculum.
What we've been very keenly aware of is that, well, until the institution gets on board, what we do with the students is on shaky ground. If there is not a comprehensive program for recruiting and retaining Indigenous staff and Indigenous leadership within those teaching groups, well, then the venture will fail.